A long time ago, in a land not so far away, people gathered in an ancient dining hall. The year was 80 AD, and the emperor was about to be served one of the most delicious meals of his life. But what would this feast include? Let's find out in today's episode of Fake Tank History. Welcome back to the channel where we bring you new original historical tales every week. Today we're going to explore the origins of macaroni and cheese. Now, if you were raised in the Western world, there's a good chance you already know that this meal traces back to a genius enslaved chef named James Hemings. He created macaroni and cheese for Thomas Jefferson while they were at the French Laundry in Paris, and then later perfected the recipe at Monticello. Although he was forced into a life of captivity and denied his freedom, James found solace in cooking and sharing his talents with others through food. Many believe macaroni and cheese became his signature dish because it allowed him to showcase his culinary skills without needing any expensive or exotic ingredients. In fact, when President Jefferson traveled to Italy, he requested macaroni and Parmesan cheese from a market near Venice, and then brought them back home to Virginia, solidifying the dish's place in American cuisine. While there is truth to these claims, they only tell part of the story. Like many beloved dishes around the world, macaroni and cheese actually has its roots planted in several ancient cultures, and without these early civilizations, the dish may have never existed. So let's break down the surprisingly biblical origins of mac and cheese. First up, we need to talk about pasta. Most people don't realize how old this ingredient really is. The earliest evidence of pasta making comes from the ancient Romans, who likely learned the technique from their neighbors in North Africa. But according to legend, it was Marcus Porcius Cato, also known as Cato the Elder, who introduced the very first noodles to Rome. According to the story, he traveled throughout Greece and observed how they used flour and water to make thin sheets of dough. So when he returned home, he began teaching people how to cook lagana, a kind of pasta that looked like a broadsheet. Eventually, lagana became synonymous with everyday meals across Rome. But if you look closely at the definition of pasta, you will see that it simply means dough, which suggests that many different shapes and sizes could technically be considered pasta. This leads us to ancient Carthage. Located in modern Tunisia, Carthage was once the capital of the largest empire in North Africa and one of Rome's biggest rivals during the late Mediterranean era. Historians know very little about this civilization because most of their records were written in phonetic characters that haven't yet been deciphered. However, excavations at the city's former port have uncovered dozens of clay bowls featuring strange stamped patterns. Researchers believe these stamp designs are recipes. So far, they have identified 4 main categories of these recipes. One set talks about fish. Another set focuses on vegetables. A third category involves poultry. And finally, the fourth group includes instructions for preparing grains and legumes. Some researchers have argued that the last category proves Carthaginians were eating a type of pasta. But their argument is a bit weak because pasta was simply one way the people prepared grains. They also ground wheat into flour, baked bread and porridge, and made desserts out of honey cakes. That said, there's no denying the abundance of grains in Carthage. The city was located along important trading routes, so merchants would frequently drop off shipments of grain from Egypt and other Mediterranean cities. Then, in the 4th century BC, Hannibal Barca led his army across the Alps and founded a new settlement in northern Italy. This expansion into Europe gave Carthage access to more wheat, barley, millet, and spelt. However, this wasn't enough to satisfy their demand for grains. At one point, Carthage imported so much wheat that the price fell by half. Obviously, everyone loved cheap bread and pasta, but this influx of grain also impacted religious practices. For example, Carthage was home to a goddess named Tanit, often represented as a woman holding 2 ears of grain. She was associated with fertility, war, wisdom, magic, and the moon, and she played a major role in everyday life. When Carthage went to war against Rome, the Punic people took her image with them wherever they went. And after the Battle of Alesia in 52 BC, Julius Caesar claimed that he defeated 900,000 Gauls because the goddess deserted them and switched over to Rome. These stories show how deeply rooted grain was in religion, politics, and daily life. And without this foundational resource, Carthage may have never shared their love of pasta with the Romans. But now it's time to talk about the origin of the second key ingredient, cheese. You might be surprised to learn that cheese is mentioned 13 times in the Bible. In fact, curdled milk appears in the Torah as one of the 7 species that God promised Abraham's descendants. This abundance of dairy dates back thousands of years before Moses led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. Ancient Hebrews kept flocks of sheep and goats, and they relied on their milk for nutrition while traveling through the desert. When the Hebrews reached Mount Sinai, however, they encountered a problem. It was springtime, and all of their goats were pregnant. If they wanted milk, they needed a way to preserve it. Luckily for them, one of their leaders figured out how to curdle goat's milk and turn it into a shelf-stable food source called cheese. From that day forward, Hebrews continued to carry cheese on their desert treks, and it became a sacred staple of their faith. In the book of Exodus, God instructs the people of Israel to sacrifice the fat of the land, including its cheese, to him, and to offer it as a gift. Cheese was also a symbol of wealth, power, and abundance. In Genesis, Jacob blessed his 12 sons and predicted that they would become powerful rulers of the world. He called one of them Israel and declared that he would produce enough milk and honey to satisfy the needs of his people. Later, the prophet Samuel said that anyone who came from Israel would bring cheese and honey with them as gifts. Even King David desired his son Solomon to prepare large quantities of milk and honey for the people of Israel. The Israelites weren't the only ones using cheese in their religious ceremonies either. Ancient Mesopotamians believed that cheese originated from the sky, and they used it in festivals dedicated to the gods Ishtar and Shamash. Over in Greece, cheese was associated with Apollo, and young girls were required to learn how to make cheese as part of their coming-of-age ritual. They also held an annual festival called the Thaia, which featured cheese games where contestants competed to identify different types of cheese by their smell alone. Cheese was such a prominent part of life that it even inspired works of art. For example, Greek vase painters depicted scenes of cheese-making and included images of cheese alongside other luxurious items. But the Greeks weren't content with just eating regular cheese. They experimented with combining different types of milk, adding fruits and herbs, and developed many varieties of cheese. The most popular was a salted sheep's milk cheese that resembled cottage cheese. Because the ancient Greeks lacked refrigeration, they stretched the curds and removed some of the liquid in order to preserve it longer. This process turned the cheese into a spongy substance that lasted for months, and it eventually evolved into a dish called pasta, cheese, or pasticcioti per casa. Now we're getting somewhere. All of this history shows that cheese and pasta date back thousands of years. But when did they combine into one delicious dish? Well, although we can't say for sure, we do have a few educated guesses. First off, we need to go back to the Middle East. Sometime before the Christian era, someone began mixing crushed hard-boiled eggs with cheese and spices, and then serving the mixture over pasta. They called it lasagna. This dish quickly spread across the region and appeared in countless variations. For example, in Persia, cooks combined pasta with butter, milk, cheese, and eggs. Then they sprinkled the whole thing with cinnamon, nutmeg, and salt. Another version of macaroni and cheese appeared in Persia around the same time, and it included milk, flour, butter, and sometimes saffron. Then in the 12th century, Arab scholars wrote about a similar dish called manaish, which consisted of rice, meat, and cheese. So clearly, macaroni and cheese had been served in many forms for centuries. But when did Europeans discover the dish? We don't know for sure, but it probably happened sometime after Arab merchants brought pasta to Sicily in the 9th century. From there, it's easy to imagine someone making the connection between pasta and cheese. They knew how to stretch cheese out by adding vinegar or wine. So all it would take is a little trial and error to develop a truly unforgettable dish. And speaking of unforgettable, remember that time Tom Cruise learned he was a Trekkie and nearly burst? Well, you won't want to miss that moment, plus all of the amazing stories behind famous celebrities and their unique traits. In the meantime, remember to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you for watching. Bye.